Vinta Tala is a dark blue that is strong with the sheen and the shimmer. Destroy a Sith Lord kind of strong. There is some slight tone shift as paper changes, and I can't say if it shades because of the sheen and the shimmer they're just so overpowering. This is a well-behaved ink that isn't aggressive, and with that, it performs well on non-fountain pen friendly paper, keeping it as a quality or keeping its quality on at the same as on premium papers. Good lord. Generally, it's good on any paper. Vinta seems to love the shimmer inks and the sheen inks. Also, with this being so well behaved, I can see someone really using this up, but unfortunately, not me. This just isn't an ink that I'm drawn to.
The pen for today is a Jinhao 51A. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Setting the tones that we're going to get, here's the Clairfontaine, where you can see that it does not feather and it does not spread. It's hard to tell if it shades at all because of the shimmer and the sheen. The darker areas that you can see, you cannot tell if it's shimmer, or sorry, if it's sheen or if it's darker, like cannot on the first line, where the C looks a little bit darker than the NO that lightens up a little bit, but that T at the end gets a little bit darker again. As I tilt my head with the light, I see sheen there, making me feel like it's not so much that it's shading, more that it's sheening. And I'm hoping that the camera angle makes it so that the shimmer that would be there isn't really kind of overpowering it. I think it's doing pretty good. Looking at the back of the page between the wiggling fingers, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue our notes back here.
Vinta makes more than just one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Vinta.
Here is Vinta Pink Sands Shimmering Santa Cruz. Here is Vinta Terracotta de Milli.
Here is Vinta Macopa. Here is Vinta Hannah.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
As a tone, this is only slightly lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, it does not feather and it does not spread. We're not getting the shimmer or the sheen here, so we can see that it does shade eventually. If you look at eventually on the first line, you see that the E starts quite a bit darker. It lightens up with the then, but the T gets quite a bit darker. The UAL lighter a little bit. The LY at the end does darken a little bit, really to the point when you look at point on the second line, where it's mostly a dark word. But as I turn, I do see that what's happening is not so much that it's darker. I can see that there is some sheen there making it darker. So it does show up as present. It just doesn't really reflect back in different colors. Again, the shimmer I'm not really getting on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and can easily continue our notes back here.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
The tone we get here is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does not have the sheen or the shimmer, and I really double check to make sure that any darker spots that we see are not the sheen, and they are not. So I hope you understand. Looking at understand on the first line, we see the shading, where the U is a little bit lighter than the N. It darkened up a little darker again into the D, lightens a little bit into the ERS. The T gets quite a bit darker, keeps that with the A, but lightens with the ND at the end. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we had no problem with bleeding, nothing at all, and ghosting. I would say that you could easily write back here. I wouldn't really consider this as too bad a thing, because this is a dark ink.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, this smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. I can't tell if it is shading because it is sheening and it is shimmering. When I was looking at the footage of as it's writing, you really don't see it happening. It's definitely there once it's dry, which is how I'm looking at it. Parts of it really do stand out with some of the shimmer and the sheen, like parts on the first line, where the P has a lot of shimmer. The AR is showing that sheen. The TS at the end is back to that shimmer being very heavy. It really does an awful lot. It can look like shading that's going on if you must call it that, like must, where the MUS is lighter than the T at the end. Now that T at the end is really that the must was giving me some shimmer, but the T is giving me the sheen more than the shimmer, not that the shimmer's not there. And we look at this paper to be able to look at it with the quad rule. It has no problem standing out against that quad rule. So if this is what you prefer, you're going to have no problem using it. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more blue inks that are out there.
Here is Colorverse Crystal Planet. Here is Diamine Skull and Roses. Here is Krishna Christmas Eve. Here is Organic Studios Nitrogen.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here, the tone on the page is quite a bit lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does not have the shimmer or the sheen. Neither can be seen at all on this paper. It's really just gobbled it entirely up. Much more quality of the paper than it is for the ink, which means we do get to see the foundations of what's going on with shading. Look at foundation on the second line, where the F is a bit darker. Keeping it into the O, the U starts to lighten a little bit, the N just a little bit more. The D-ation at the end gets darker again and stays dark. So it does have the ability to do some shading. And it still stands out against this quad rule without any kind of a problem. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Diamine Pink Glitz. Here is Monteverde Motivation. Here is Robert Oster Claret. Here is Ackerman Dutch Masters number 3.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
The tone we're getting here is quite a bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather and it does spread. Although I want to say both the feather and the spread, if you adjust the size of your writing, are easily manageable, making this an ink that you can use on this paper if you wanted to. I'm not seeing any kind of shading. I'm not seeing the sheen. I'm not seeing the shimmer. I'm just seeing that, yes, you could use this if you wanted to on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, you see how deep this ink really does get into this paper quite a bit, making it impossible to use back here because of that extreme ghosting. But on the page underneath, we get a lot of dots through, quite aggressive. So it's going to go ahead and dot that page underneath, making it pretty unusable on 20-pound copy paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The fine Jinhao 51A has a medium flow nib and performs well everywhere with generally no shading to be found. Now off camera, I used a very wet find just to see if this ink is really aggressive. Might it bleed through or ghost? And it really didn't. The only place I saw anything happen was that 20-pound copy paper, and it's hard to hold that against any ink. So I think it is both the shimmer and the sheen that will really attract people to this ink. A broad will drown the page with the sparkle, and I really would then For that reason, go with a medium flow, fine nib. This is so that you can still get nice crisp lines that you can read without any problem, and that the shimmer and sheen get to show as something, as more of a feature of this ink and not a distraction of it, like what was seen in the writing samples.